All right, so why don't we start? Last week we did an introduction to Judges, and we started chapter 1. So I want to finish chapter 1 and do chapter 2 today as well. Okay. Both chapter 1 and chapter 2 are still introductions, if you will, to the book of Judges. And just to recap what we saw last week we, of course, it begins with the death of Joshua. And we have, on the one hand, summaries of some of the areas that were conquered and by which tribes. We have a few little stories of these conquests. One of the stories is assumption that is happening after Joshua's death, which is the story at the beginning about the conquest of Bezek. But we also have a repetition of an earlier story with the conquest of Hebron by Caleb from the tribe of Judah, and that's in verse 19. We also learn of different areas of the country that have not been captured. And this is going to remain a basic theme in both chapters 1 and chapter 2. One little story, if you will, that I just want to bring your attention to in chapter 1, starting in verse 22. The house of Joseph, for their part, advanced against Bethel, and the Lord was with them. While the house of Joseph were scouting at Bethel, the name of the town was formerly Luz, their patrol saw a man leaving the town. They said to him, "Just show us how to get into the town and we will treat you kindly." He showed them how to get into the town. They put the town to the sword, but they let the man and all his relatives go free. The man went to the Hittite country. He founded a city and named it Luz, and that has been its name to this day. So this, again, is just one of a few stories that we saw in chapter 1 of additional conquests that happened after Joshua's death. And this is a nice one. It's a successful one. They captured Bethel. A few comments, though, just to give you some context here. So first of all, you will recall, I'm sure, that Bethel is and Luz, those two names for the city, is something we already know in the beginning of Genesis. When we first encounter this city, this is Abraham. Okay, Abraham comes into the land. His first stop is in the Oak of Moreh. I'm in Genesis 12, and his second stop is in Bethel. And there we have, let's see, in chapter 12, verse 7, the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "I will assign this land to your offspring." He built an altar there. From there, he moved on to the hill country east of Bethel and pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east, and he built there an altar to the Lord and invoked the Lord by name. Then Abram journeyed by stages towards the Negev. Now, we learn later on, let me just see if I meant to have that written down, but I'm not sure I did. 1 second. We learn later on, though, again, that this was a different name. I think maybe with Jacob also names the area Bethel. It's the very same one. And we learn there that the name initially was Luz. And so we have a sense here that there seems to be a battle of names. Okay. On the one hand, you have, starting with Abraham, our forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, referring to this place as Bethel, as Bethel means the house of the Lord. Okay. And it is in this place that Abraham first builds an altar, and later on Jacob sleeps and has the dream and the vision of the angels going up and down. And so from the beginning, we have named this place for God. And yet we know that there's an alternative Canaanite name, and that is Luz. Okay. Now I would assume that in the days of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the use of the name Bethel was a private name. It was something that was in the family of Abraham, and nobody else knew that name. Okay. Here, though, we have something very interesting. Here we have the actual conquest of Bethel, and from this time forward, it will only be called Bethel. We have the encounter of these people from the house of Joseph, which would be Ephraim and Manasseh. And there's some people that say that may also have included the tribe of Benjamin, because Benjamin and Joseph were both from the children of Rachel. So they have this special, closeness between them. So they go together to conquer Bethel. And this is actually a place that's on the border between Benjamin and Ephraim, so it really is makes sense for all of them to be involved in this. Anyway, so we have this Canaanite holding on to the name of Luz. He is saved from the city, from its destruction. He goes all the way up north to the Hittite, which is in Syria of today, and he then starts a new city and calls it Luz. I am reminded of this very often, the battle of names that we are witness to today in Israel, okay? There are names such as, let's say what everyone knows, Jerusalem. Okay, we all know Jerusalem. Jerusalem goes back to the Bible, and for centuries, everybody only called Jerusalem, Jerusalem. There is, however, an Arab name to Jerusalem. They call it El Quds. And today, you will see, as part of Palestinian propaganda, very often, they will insist on calling it El Quds. They will never use the word Jerusalem, because if they're going to use the name Jerusalem, it is as if they are admitting that our claim to the area is a legitimate claim. And the same thing happens with Judea and Samaria with those words, where the Palestinians insist on calling it either Palestine or West Bank. Okay, and we're calling it Judea and Samaria because those are the names from the Bible. And of course, there's not the same situation going on here with this fellow from Beit El, but I think it's very interesting in this idea of the preservation of the name. It is very important when the tribe of Joseph conquers Beit El, assigning the name that represents the connection between the children of Israel, the nation of Israel, and the land of Israel, and the God of Israel. And that is all in that name of Beit El, which was originally assigned to that place by Abraham. And yet, this fellow has no connection to that name Beit El. He knows the place is Luz, and he's going to take the name Luz with him. Okay, now I have no problem with him, because he takes the name Luz with him and he leaves the land of Israel. He leaves it to the nation of Israel, and he goes elsewhere and he puts himself a town called Luz. And that, I think, is a very interesting model for something that we could follow even today. And it also gives you a sense of name. So anyway, that was just a small little story that I think is worth paying attention to. All right, and we continued, and we saw some of this last week, of all these different places that they did not conquer. I would just point out, I'm seeing if this will work. I would like to share a screen. Did this work? There we go. Can you see the screen?
Yes.
Right. Yes, okay. Good, because then I lost you all of a sudden. All right, anyway, so, all right, anyway, so you see the map, right? And you'll notice that we're talking about different parts of what was conquered and what was not conquered. So you'll see, wait a second. Okay, so look at still in chapter 1, verse 18. In verse 18, we learn that Judah captured Gaza, Ashkelon, and Ekron. Now, if you look here, okay, this area here that is labeled as Philistia, okay, we see Gaza, we see Ashkelon, and Ekron is actually right here, okay, which is shown on this map as actually being part of Dan. But it's very close to the area of Judah. Okay, but what you see here is that while Judah's territory is here, it does not include this area, which is Ashkelon and Gaza. And it's named on the map as Philistia. What actually happens? They conquered the area, but then let's look at verse 19. The Lord was with Judah so that they took possession of the hill country, but they were not able to dispossess the inhabitants of the plain, for they had iron chariots. And this is exactly what we're talking about. Judah that is here, they actually conquered this whole area, but they were only able to actually settle here. They did not get rid of the Canaanites that were here at the coast. What happens, and we will see this in the book of Judges, is that the Philistines who come in from the sea will therefore settle in this area, because in a sense, it is a political vacuum. Even though it was originally conquered by Judah, because they did not settle it, because they did not get rid of the remaining Canaanites and control it in the way they should have, it was an open place for the Philistines to come in. Okay, so I want to stop sharing, but how do I do that? Here we go, stop share. Okay, I'm back. All right, so that just gives you an example. And we saw also in Dan, oh, I want to go back to that. Sorry, I meant to show you that. Okay, you'll see Dan over here. Dan has this, it's a small tribe, and they have this small area here. Part of it is on the coast, just north of this Philistine area, and then part of it borders on Judah. So let's see what we learn about the tribe of Dan from here. And in verse 34, the Amorites pressed the Danites into the hill country. They would not let them come down to the plain. Okay, so here you have a situation where this is an area where they actually conquered and settled, but they have ongoing problems from the Amorites in the region. And we learn that they're pushing them away from the plain into the hill country. Later on, when we learn about Samson, this is going to be very significant because it is Samson who comes from the tribe of Dan, and he's in this area. He's not on the coast. And at the end of the book, we're going to learn what happens to the tribe of Dan. But the introduction to Dan's issue is right here in chapter 1. Okay, so that more or less gives you, let's stop the share. Okay, gives you a sense of what chapter 1 is about. Now we move into chapter 2. Chapter 2 remains an introduction to Judges, but of a different sort. If chapter 1 laid the historical and geographical foundations, what happened, Joshua was the leader, he died, this is what they conquered, this is what they didn't conquer. So as that you go into chapter 2 and to the rest of the book of Judges, you understand more or less geographically by the map and a little bit historically of where the nation of Israel is. Chapter 2 is going to focus more on the spiritual situation of the nation of Israel. And indeed, towards the end of chapter 2, we're going to have not just an introduction to the book of Judges, but in a way, a summary of the book of Judges. What goes on in the book of Judges? So let's begin. The first part of chapter 2, we have a very interesting story. We have a story about, now here I'm going to use the Hebrew word. The Hebrew word is malach, a malach of God. Now the question is, what is a malach? Now a malach is very often, perhaps even most often, translated as an angel. And in fact, in my English translation, it says it's an angel of God who comes up from the Gilgal to the Bochim. Now Bochim is the name of a place, but we don't know how it gets its name until the end of this little story, which is in verse 5. Bochim, though, means crying. The people who cry, that's Bochim. So it's talking about crying. And this story is going to tell us what happened in Bochim and how Bochim got its name. Okay, the first question is, who is this malach? Is it an angel? And in fact, there's two different interpretations. Is it an angel or is it in fact a prophet? Now, there is precedent for using the word malach for a prophet. And one of the examples that I saw was in Haggai. Haggai, verse, you don't have to look at it, just if you could take a look, Haggai chapter 1, verse 13, there Haggai himself is referred to in the Hebrew as a malach of God. Now, in your English, it probably says a prophet or a messenger, okay? The word malach can mean messenger of God. It can mean an angel of God. It can be a prophet in the sense that a prophet is a messenger of God. But what's the difference between an angel and a prophet? A prophet is a man, an angel is some kind of spiritual being, okay? Now, when the three angels appeared to Abraham, the word there is the same word, malach, but there it is talking about angels. In this book, in the book of Judges, we have angels appearing to Gideon and to the parents of Samson, okay? And those are understood as being angels. So why would even anyone question that this might not be an angel? So first of all, let's read the verses and then see what's talking about here, okay? An angel of the Lord came up, or a malach, or a prophet, or whoever, came up from Gilgal to Bochim and said, I brought you up from Egypt, and I took you into the land which I had promised on oath to your fathers. And I said, I will never break my covenant with you. And you, for your part, must make no covenant with the inhabitants of this land. You must tear down their altars. But you have not obeyed me. Look what you have done. Therefore, I have resolved not to drive them out before you. They shall become your oppressors, and their God shall be a snare to you. As the angel of the Lord spoke these words to all the Israelites, the people broke into weeping. So they named the place Bochim. Again, Bochim means those who weep. and they offered sacrifices there to the Lord. Okay, so again, this translation treats it as an angel, but why is this a problem? For one thing, this fellow does not talk like an angel. He talks like a prophet. Angels do not rebuke. Prophets rebuke. Prophets come to God with a message and say, guys, you haven't been doing what you're supposed to do. Repent, get your act together. That is a classic role of a prophet. An angel, for example, an angel comes to Gideon and says, you're going to fight this battle. God will be with you. An angel comes to the parents of Samuel and said, you're going to have a baby. Okay. An angel comes to Abraham and says to him, you're going to have a baby. Angels come to Lot and save him from the Sodom, from the destruction of Sodom, and so on and so forth. An angel is there to bring a message of encouragement, to help, to preserve, to save. That's what angels do. Angels don't stand up there and rebuke and tell people what to do. Okay, so that is why I think why there are people who have questioned whether this in fact is an angel or a prophet. You can choose whichever way you want. Angel or prophet, doesn't matter. What does matter, of course, is the content of the message. And the content of the message here is very clear. It is basically saying God is expressing disappointment here with the nation. They brought you up from Egypt. What did they do wrong? Okay, he's saying that I told you you're not supposed to violate my covenant and don't enter into a covenant with the nations. He says, but you didn't listen to what I did. And therefore, I say, I am not going to get rid of this, the nations that are here. They will remain here and be a trap for you. Now, this idea of the nations being a trap is something that we have seen already. We have seen it in Deuteronomy. We have seen it in Exodus. We have seen it in Numbers. We have this kind of situation of the relationship between these nations staying here, being a trap, and then leading the nation into sin. What I'd like to do now is just take a look at a couple of those places that we've seen before, and I think will help us understand what's going on here. Okay, so first of all, let's look at Deuteronomy 7. Deuteronomy 7, verse 22. Here we first of all, if I go back a little bit, one second. Okay, so what this is, the context of this is the fear that the nation of Israel may be feeling at this point. This is just before they enter the land. Of will they be successful in conquering the nations in the land of Israel? And the verse that I want to refer to here is verse 22. The Lord your God will dislodge these people before you little by little. You will not be able to put an end to them at once, else the wild beasts would multiply to your herd. Now, we've discussed this before. We have seen this, and we're going to see it in other places, that there's kind of a trap that's built in to what the nation of Israel has to do. On the one hand, they're commanded to get rid of the nations there. On the other hand, they're already told in advance that it cannot happen instantly. Okay, Jericho, the walls fall instantly. They actually captured most of the land not instantly, but within a few years. Okay, the process, though, of actually taking control of the land and getting rid of the people who are in there is a gradual process. And the problem with the gradual process is that it's very easy to stop in the middle. And that's the challenge that we are now seeing as happen as we begin the book of Judges. Now, let's just look at Exodus chapter 23, verse 33. Okay, first I want to look at verse 23. Actually begins in verse 20. Here, God says, I am sending an angel before you to guard you on the way and to bring you to the place that I have made ready. Okay, and then it goes on in 23. When my angel goes before you and brings you to the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Canaanites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, and I annihilate them, you shall not bow down to their gods and worship or follow their practices, but shall tear them down and smash their pillars to bits. Okay, so we have the same idea, but yet we have verse 29, I will not drive them out before you in a single year, lest the land become desolate and the wild beasts multiply to your hurt. I will drive them out before you little by little until you have increased and possessed the land. And then it goes on in verse 32, but you shall make no covenant with them and their gods. They shall not remain in your land, lest they cause you to sin against me, for you will serve their gods, and it will prove a snare to you. Now, what's very interesting about this section of scripture in Exodus is that it refers to an angel. Okay, and so if you would interpret the beginning of chapter 2 to refer to an actual angel, it's very possible it is this angel that God has sent to assist the nation on his behalf with the capture of the land. And it is that angel who's been there all along, making sure the conquest goes, and it does, it goes forward, and it's supposed to go forward little by little. That's the original plan. And yet there we have the warning, don't get stuck because they will become snares. And here you have the angel coming up from the Gilgal. The Gilgal, of course, is where the original camp was, from where they went to battle. So it makes a lot of sense that this angel would come out from the Gilgal, okay? And then you're going to come up, and at that point, the angel is going to rebuke the nation and say, okay, you were supposed to continue, and you didn't, and you stopped. And so instead of continuing on this mission, you are allowing these nations to become snares. And this would have probably taken place after the death of Joshua, sometime before things get really, really bad, but they're on their way. And you get a sense here that there's a spiritual slide. It is not about what they haven't conquered and how strong the nations may be. This is all presented in a spiritual way. It is all about leaving the nations who are therefore exerting their negative and pagan influences on the nation, and that in and itself is creating the problem. So that, in a way, I look at as the spiritual heading for this chapter 2. Starting in verse 6, we go again to remind ourselves about Joshua, what happened, but the message here is one of very important one. The message here is that Joshua and his generation, okay, were fine. They were good people. They followed God, and there the problem didn't start there. Now remember, when Joshua died, he already said to the nation, there's land here that we haven't conquered. There's an element of rebuke, but what we learn here is that there was nothing wrong with Joshua. Joshua conquered as much as he was supposed to conquer in his lifetime. What he's doing is warning the nation after his death, you have to continue. And they continue a little bit. We learn about that in chapter 1. They did bits and pieces, okay, but then they didn't do enough. It's very, very clear here, and we will see it also at the end of the chapter, that Joshua himself was fine. The problem was what happens afterwards. And starting in verse 10, we find out how this all goes down. You know, what transpires next. And all that generation were likewise gathered to their fathers. Another generation rose after them, which had not experienced the deliverance of the Lord or the deeds that he had wrought for Israel. And the Israelites did what was offensive to the Lord. They worshiped the Baal, and forsook the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. They followed other gods from among the gods of the peoples around them. So here we see a very practical understanding of what happens. You leave the nations there. It's not just that you are not enough in control of all of the land and of the nations, but the nations being there exert their influence. And now we have a spiritual problem. Now we have a situation where the nation of Israel is abandoning God, abandoning its covenant with God, and instead starting to worship the gods of the pagan nations. Okay, and then we have a whole description of all these things that they did, what they worshipped. Let's look at verse 13. They forsook the Lord, they worshiped Baal and the Ashtaroth. Then the Lord was incensed at Israel, and he handed them over to foes. Now, beginning here, what we're basically seeing here, it's written in a past tense, okay? And when we're reading it at the beginning of Judges, we're thinking, oh, this is what happened before. It isn't. Starting at this point, this whole section actually from 6, okay, to the end of the chapter, what is actually happening. This is a summary of Judges. This is what happened before Judges. I want to give you the outline of Judges. This is what's going to happen throughout the book of Judges. This is the pattern. You're going to see it now. And then starting in chapter 3, we're going to start learning about the individual judges and what actually happened. Okay. But here we have an overview. It's written in the past tense, but keep in mind that this encompasses the book of Judges. This doesn't come before the book of Judges. And I'm going to read through this rest of the chapter, and you'll see this is the summary of Judges. Okay. Then the Lord was incensed at Israel, and he handed them over to foes who plundered them. He surrendered them to their enemies on all sides, and they could no longer hold their own against their enemies. In all their campaigns, the hand of the Lord was against them to their undoing, as the Lord had declared, and as the Lord had sworn to them, and they were in great distress. Then the Lord raised up judges. Here it says chieftains, but it's judges, whatever we discussed about how we define judges. Let's call them judges, okay? But they really function as leaders and saviors, not as judges. Then the Lord raised up judges who delivered them from those who plundered them, but they did not heed their judges either. They went astray after other gods and bowed down to them. They were quick in turn to turn aside from the way their fathers had followed. In obedience to the commandments of the Lord, they did not do right. When the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord would be with the judge and would save them from their enemies during the judge's lifetime. For the Lord would be moved to pity by their moanings because of those who oppressed and crushed them. But when the judge died, they would again act basely, even more than the preceding generation, following other gods, worshiping them and bowing down to them. They omitted none of their practices and stubborn ways. Then the Lord became incensed against Israel, and he said, since that nation has transgressed the covenant that I enjoined upon their fathers and has not obeyed me, I, for my part, will no longer drive out before them any of the nations that Joshua left when he died. Okay, I want to just stop here for a moment. And what we see here is the story of Judges. The nation sins, they leave God. God enables the oppressors. It's the same oppressors, these same nations who are the ones who are influencing the nation to follow in their ways. The same people are now coming as enemies to physically oppress the nation. And the nation at some point, so oppressed, cries out to God. God sends a judge. The judge comes in as a savior. He does his whatever, fights. We'll learn them all. They're all different stories. They save the nation. But then what does God say here? Even after I sent this person and he, saves them, they just forget about God afterwards. Everything is fine, very nice for a short period of time. And then they go back to their old ways and it repeats itself again, which is what we have. And then God again brings back an oppressor and onward. And that is the cycle of Judges. Okay. What we have though, at the very end of this chapter though, goes back to our understanding of what was Joshua, how things ended at the end of Joshua's life and how they were supposed to continue, but did not. Because it says here, I, for my part, will no longer drive them out before them, any of the nations that Joshua left when he died. Okay. And now starting in 22, we're going to understand what was the point of having some nations left when Joshua died. Okay. That Joshua did not managed to finish that job in his lifetime. We saw the scriptures that talked about the necessity of doing this gradually for very different reasons, but here we're going to get a different reason. For it was in order to test Israel by them, to see whether or not they would faithfully walk in the ways of the Lord as their fathers had done, that the Lord had left those nations instead of driving them out at once and had not delivered them into the hands of Joshua. So here we have a different answer. If we talked about chapter 1 being a more practical, geographical, geopolitical situation that gives us, brings us into Judges, chapter 2 gives us a spiritual perspective. This too is a spiritual perspective. We learned before that it was important to drive out the nations gradually to prevent wild animals and, to whatever else needs to be done. It's good to do it gradually and not all at once. But here we have a spiritual reason. God did not want to create a bubble. He wanted us to have to deal with these foreign nations to test us. How are we going to respond to the nations amongst us? Would we resist their influences? Would we continue the process of driving them out? or would we get stuck? And therefore, basically, God is saying here, it is not for God to give us the easy life, because then we have no free choice. If everything about the land of Israel becomes the walls of Jericho falling down, we have no free choice. And God enters into a covenant with us. And a covenant means we have a choice. We can choose to do good and be rewarded. We can choose to do bad and be punished. And so even here at the end of chapter 2, we have this understanding that throughout this book and throughout our history, we always will have a choice. And God will keep the challenges before us, challenges that we are capable of withstanding. And the test will be, do we actually withstand those challenges, or do we succumb and fail? And as you will see in Judges constantly succumb and fail. And, that will take us, it goes from bad to worse. But this is the introductory chapters. We will be ready to really start into the meat of Judges next week when we start chapter 3. If anybody has any questions or comments, I see there was some questions about the word malach, M-A-L-A-C-H probably, or K-H is fine. Malach is the Hebrew word for angel. That's what I've seen now. Anybody wants to comment, unmute yourselves. Yes, Claudette, please.
I have 3 questions. One is there a place called Luz today? Because he said he left Bethel and he went up somewhere to call that
Luz,
place.
yeah.
Luz, right? The next question is the word for judges in Hebrew, because many times in the book of Judge, it says chieftain, and then it says judge. So what is the word in Hebrew? And is it clearly chieftain or judge?
Okay.
And the other question is not so much a question, it's something I want to share with you. I went and did some research about the timeline of the Jewish people, and you can find that information on Torah Box Team. It's an Orthodox organization. What you will get is a printout like that.
Yeah. And
it literally says that the judges period was from 1274 to 881.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Yes.
So that was my research. But
400 years. Yeah.
Yeah. My other
it's definitely about 400 years. So let me just answer your questions. I do not know of a place today that I do know the area would have been in Syria, northern Syria, probably, because that's where the Hittites were. But I don't know that there's a place today that's called Luz. As for judges and chieftains, we discussed this last week in our class. If you missed it, you might want to go back and see the recording. The Hebrew word is shoftim. And what we discuss is the fact, generally, the word shofet or shoftim refers to judges, but there's also precedent for it being a ruler or a leader. And we loosely, the book of Judges is called Judges in Hebrew. Every time, though, that it's translated as shoftim, it's this as chieftains, it's the exact same word in Hebrew. So they got to get their act together. But that's because the word itself is confusing. And I think there's only one person in the book of Judges who is actually a judge, and that's Deborah. She judges people. People come to her with their disputes, and she adjudicates them. Everybody else is called a judge, but they really are a leader or someone who's coming to rescue or to save the nation from an oppressor. So it's a struggle with the word, but that's what it means.
Is it the same word? Is it the same word that was used when Yitro talked to Moses? Was he a judge?
Yes, same word. Yeah. Okay,
Thank
now
you.
there's someone that says with iPhone, that's the only thing I have with them, but they've raised their hand and I don't see them. Do you want to say
That's
something?
me, Sondra. That's me. Joy.
Oh, Joy.
Yes.
Hi, Joy.
I'm walking.
Oh, there you are.
So, yes, yeah. Up
Did
in
you want to ask a question?
Galilee. Yes, I did.
Okay.
Are there any lessons to be drawn from the fact that in Joshua's day, God said, do not enter into any treaty with your enemies? Are there any
Oh, yeah.
modern day lessons to be drawn from that?
Yes.
Okay, well, first of all, I think it's something we need to all be aware of. I think what was going on in the Bible was the fear of the treaty. And actually, I studied with a teacher once who did a whole research on what these treaties were. They were typically, okay, they would have these empires that would enter into treaties with lesser states, like vassal states, okay? Typically, what would happen in the case of a treaty, though, whether it was that situation or others, was that you were always going to give something up, okay? If you enter into a treaty, you're going to be giving something up that is sacred to you. And that is something that you cannot have. And the other problems we see throughout here, when they're juxtaposed against each other, you are supposed to keep your covenant with God and not enter into a covenant with the nations. And so that really, I see, is the bottom line. Entering into a practical treaty or agreement with nations is something that happens throughout history, and I don't think anybody has a problem with that. The problem is, are you going to be entering into a treaty that in some way contradicts your covenant with God? Now, the word covenant and the word treaty is the same word in Hebrew. They're both brit, okay? So that is the issue. Do not enter into a treaty with a nation that will interfere with your covenant with God. And that is what exactly we can see here. As soon as they'll let the people stay in the land and then just took taxes from them, they ended up influencing them. And they created a situation where they turned their back on the covenant with God. And that clearly is a problem.
Can I be a bit controversial here? My understanding is that the Abraham Accords requires Israel not to declare sovereignty over Judea and Samaria.
Okay, so the Accords do not say that at all.
Oh,
At
I've
all.
seen it in writing.
No, wait. The Accords themselves do not say it. What happened was that as part of the Accords, okay, word has it that these were the commitments that were given. And this is something that was said by, well, Bibi did not want to admit it. Okay, when Bibi came back from the ceremony, he says, we gave up nothing, absolutely nothing. Okay, but later on, there were people involved in both the American and in the Israeli government who admitted that this was a quid pro quo, but it wasn't part of the treaty. So you can say the Abraham Accords themselves really were about trade. If they had just been about trade, it wouldn't have been a problem. Okay, and that's actually good. But the problem is, did they give this quid pro quo? And it seems they did. And that, of course, makes it extremely problematic.
Yes, yes.
But that's very political.
Agreed. Oh, no, but it's Bible, not to give
You're
up
right.
your land.
You're right. It's
isn't
Bible,
it?
but you know how other people will have different interpretations of the same thing, and that's fine. Diane, what did you want to ask?
I've wanted to, I'm wondering about the times that these different judges were actually used by God to take care of their enemies. I think Samson, this said 20 years he was a judge. Somebody else was a judge for maybe 10 or 15 years. And I'm wondering if during those years, they may have acted to settle disputes and acted in a way as a judge. And that is maybe one reason why they would be referred to as a judge, that it would.
It's very possible. I think it's a wonderful, wonderful interpretation. Very possible. One of the things that we do know about these judges is that they're lesser leaders than a king.
Yes.
So they don't have that far-ranging authority to set up government and to run the whole country. What exactly they did after they finished leading the battle to defeat whatever enemy they were up against, it's impossible to know, but it's very possible that it included being a judge. Now, there's one man who is not actually listed in the book of Judges as a judge, but he is considered by Jewish tradition to be the final judge, and that is Eli. We meet Eli at the beginning of the book of Samuel, and he's a high priest in the tabernacle, but he clearly functions as a leader of sorts. Okay. And of course, Samuel takes over after him, Samuel, he's already something else. Okay, he's not a
Right.
judge, he's a prophet, he's the one who anoints the kings. So
Mhm.
you see that during, there was Deborah, we know, was a judge. Eli was a high priest. Some of these other people, we're not sure what they did. The Bible
Right.
doesn't tell us. We assume, like you said, that they had some leadership role, because the Bible will tell us that the land rested, or the people were at peace for X number of years,
Mhm.
for the rest of the life of this judge. And he continued to judge for whatever. So yeah, I think you're right. That must possibly have included judging, but I
Okay.
don't know.
Now, the
I
other
thought-
thing, I support an organization called Christians for Israel, and they put out a publication every 2 months, and with interesting articles about the situation in Israel, about the growth of anti-Semitism in Europe, for instance, and things like that. There was a very interesting article in that just a few years ago now, about the consequences, or the apparent consequences, to the American leaders or to the US whenever they pressured Israel to give up land. They suffered. I mean, it was just a day or two later that one of the presidents, I think he lost his summer home up in New England because of a big storm. And it was really intriguing, and you could hardly ignore the fact that how quickly these disasters happened after Israel had been pressured by the US to give up land and had given up land.
So first of all, I appreciate those comments. I know the organizations Christians for Israel very, very well. They are actually very strong supporters of our work, and we are very grateful to them. They have an international magazine, and they also have separate inserts into that magazine from different countries. And in fact, I have recently started submitting articles to the Australian version. I also have had recently an article in the New Zealand version. And I've had also in the past articles in the Dutch version, but that of course gets translated into Dutch. It is a Dutch-based organization. The article you're referring to was probably written by a fellow named Bill Koenig, who has really devoted his life to tracking these sorts of things, the extent to which nations are punished when they turn their backs on Israel. I, in fact, had the opportunity to enjoy breakfast with him just a few weeks ago when I was in Dallas. And he's a great guy, and he's really, followed these things very closely. Anyway, that's it. Anyone else? Okay. Wait, Joy, did you want to say something else?
I have one question.
No.
Okay. Kim, yes.
So the word, I'm gonna totally slaughter it, so I don't know that I'm gonna say it, but that's translated angel or prophet.
Right.
Does that have a root in like Melech, like king? I mean,
No.
it sounds like Melech.
It does, but it has
it's
an
not
extra-
close.
No, it has an extra
It's not even
word.
related.
No,
Okay, or
it has
extra
an
letter.
extra word, so it's not. It actually, I would say the basic translation of that word is messenger.
Oh, okay.
It's a messenger, but it's very often referred to as an angel who is a messenger of God.
Right.
And in that case of Haggai is a messenger of God who is actually a prophet.
Right. Okay.
So
I just was wondering if it was the same root as Melech, because it sure sounded like Melech. It was close.
Well, it's very close, and it just has one extra letter. Otherwise, it would be the same word. But it's not related, actually.
Okay. Cool.
Okay. Anyway, have a great day, everybody, and we will see you again next week.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye. My pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
I hope you enjoyed that video, and we'd like to be sure you're getting all of our video content. So just click on the subscribe button below, as well as on the notification bell, and that way you will have easy access to all our material. We look forward to staying in touch with you. God bless you, and have a wonderful day.